Just a few years after winning independence from Britain, the United States almost tore itself apart over whiskey. Yeah, you heard that right, whiskey. In 1794, George Washington, the guy who led the Revolutionary War, had to get back on his horse and lead an army. Not against the British this time, but against his own citizens. Farmers in western Pennsylvania were so angry about a tax on whiskey that they started what we now call the Whiskey Rebellion. And honestly, when you dig into what was happening, you start to understand why they were so pissed off. Let's back up to 1789. The Constitution is brand new. George Washington just became the first president. Everyone is excited about this whole democracy thing. But there's a massive problem. The country is broke, like seriously broke. During the Revolutionary War, the federal government and the individual states borrowed a ton of money. We're talking about $54 million in federal debt, plus another $25 million that the states owed. In today's money, that would be billions. And all these lenders, they wanted their money back. Enter Alexander Hamilton. He's the first Secretary of the Treasury, and his job is basically to figure out how to pay for everything. Hamilton has this big vision. He wants the federal government to take over all the state debts and make it one big national debt. His thinking is that this will make the new government stronger and give wealthy people a reason to support it, since they would be holding federal bonds. Now, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison weren't thrilled about this plan. They thought Hamilton was giving too much power to the federal government and helping rich speculators. But they made a deal. Hamilton got his debt plan. In return, the nation's capital would move from up north to a spot on the border between Maryland and Virginia, which we now call Washington, D.C. Cool, problem solved, right? Not quite, because now Hamilton had to figure out how to actually pay back all that debt. In 1791, Hamilton proposed something that had never been done before, an excise tax. That's a tax on goods made and sold inside the country. And the specific good he picked? Distilled spirits, mainly whiskey. Congress passed it in March of 1791. The tax ranged from 6 to 18 cents per gallon, depending on how much you produced. If you had a big distillery, you paid around 6 cents per gallon and could pay once a year. Small producers got hit with up to 9 cents per gallon and had to pay throughout the year. Oh, and it had to be paid in cash. No credit, no bartering, just cold hard money. Hamilton thought this was brilliant. To him, whiskey was a luxury, a sin tax that would bring in revenue without hurting everyday people too much. Some social reformers even supported it, thinking it might discourage heavy drinking. But Hamilton was thinking like someone from the East Coast cities. He completely misread what whiskey meant to people living on the frontier. Here's what you need to understand about life in western Pennsylvania in the 1790s. These people were living on the frontier. The Appalachian Mountains separated them from the eastern cities. They didn't have good roads. No highways, no trucks, just dirt paths through the mountains that were barely passable. If you were a farmer out there, you grew corn, rye, wheat, and barley. That was your harvest. But here's the problem. How do you get that grain to market? You'd have to pack it on horses or wagons and haul it over those mountains. It was heavy, it took up a lot of space, and by the time you got it to Philadelphia or other eastern markets, you'd spent so much on transportation that you barely made any profit. So what do these farmers do? They turn their grain into whiskey. Think about it. A whole bunch of grain could be condensed down into a few barrels of liquor. Way easier to transport, way more profitable. A gallon of whiskey was worth way more than the same amount of grain. But it gets better. Whiskey wasn't just a product to sell. It was money, literally. Out on the frontier, cash was super scarce. People didn't have coins jingling in their pockets. So they used whiskey as currency. You needed to pay for something, you trade whiskey for it. Need to hire someone? Pay them in whiskey. It was the local economy. One more thing. These weren't huge commercial operations. Most of these were small family farms. They'd have a little still set up, distill their extra grain, and that's how they survived. About a quarter of all the whiskey in America was being made in 4 counties in southwestern Pennsylvania: Allegheny, Washington, Fayette, and Westmoreland. So when Hamilton slapped a tax on whiskey, he wasn't just taxing a drink, He was taxing these people's livelihood, their currency, and their way of life. Let's talk about who got hurt by this tax and who didn't. Big distilleries back east were fine. They had cash on hand, they could pay the lower rate of 6 cents per gallon once a year, and honestly, they just passed the cost on to their customers. If you were buying whiskey in Philadelphia, you paid a bit more. No big deal. Small farmers in the West got crushed. They were paying almost twice as much per gallon. They had to pay multiple times throughout the year. And remember, they didn't have cash. Their wealth was in grain and whiskey. The tax literally required them to give up their money to pay for the privilege of making their money. Oh, and if you didn't pay, you had to go to federal court. In Pennsylvania, that meant traveling 300 miles to Philadelphia, 5 days of travel, each way. If you're a small farmer, that's not just expensive. It could ruin you. You'd be away from your farm for weeks during planting or harvest season. You'd have to pay for the trip. And if you lost, you'd owe the tax plus penalties. Compare that to the American Revolution. The colonists complained about taxation without representation, right? Well, now these Western farmers felt the same way. They had elected representatives, sure, but those representatives were mostly wealthy, Eastern guys who didn't understand frontier life. The farmers felt like the government was in Philadelphia, making decisions that helped Philadelphia and treating them like second-class citizens. And it wasn't just about the tax. The Western settlers felt like the federal government ignored their real problems. Native American tribes were fighting to keep their land. The Northwest Indian War was going badly for the United States, with major defeats in 1791. Spain controlled New Orleans and wouldn't let Americans use the Mississippi River for trade. From the Western perspective, the government wasn't protecting them or helping them economically, but it sure was quick to tax them. So you had all this resentment building up, and in 1791, it started spilling over. As soon as people heard about the tax, they refused to pay it. But it wasn't just passive resistance. It got violent pretty quickly. In September 1791, just months after the tax passed, a tax collector named Robert Johnson was attacked. 11 men dressed up in women's clothes surrounded him, stripped him naked, tarred and feathered him, stole his horse, and left him in the woods. Johnson recognized 2 of the attackers and reported them. When officers tried to arrest those guys, they got attacked too. Whipped, tarred, feathered, and beaten up. The protesters were using the same tactics the Sons of Liberty used during the Revolution. Tarring and feathering, intimidating officials, destroying property. They'd show up at tax collectors' houses in the middle of the night, threaten them, and force them to resign. Even farmers who tried to comply with the tax weren't safe. Their neighbors would attack them, sometimes destroying their stills, treating them like traitors. President Washington proclaimed in September 1792, basically telling people to knock it off. Congress even modified the law a bit in May 1792 to address some complaints. The tax went down by 1 penny per gallon, and in June 1794, they changed it so you could appear in local state courts instead of having to go all the way to Philadelphia. But none of it mattered. The anger kept building. For about 3 years, tax collectors barely collected anything. They were too scared to do their jobs. The whole system was breaking down. Meanwhile, Western Pennsylvanians were organizing. They held meetings at places like Redstone Fort. They elected delegates. They sent petitions to Congress asking for the tax to be repealed. They tried the legal route first. When that didn't work, some wanted to get more radical. There were moderates like Hugh Henry Brackenridge and Albert Gallatin, who would later become Secretary of the Treasury under Jefferson, trying to keep things peaceful. But the radicals were getting louder. And then came the summer of 1794. In May 1794, Federal District Attorney William Rawle decided to crack down. He issued subpoenas to more than 60 distillers in western Pennsylvania who hadn't paid the tax. These were writs, legal papers ordering them to appear in federal court. Now here's where it gets complicated. Congress had just changed the law so people could go to local courts, but U.S. Marshal David Lennox had already been sent out to serve these writs, and they still said you had to go to Philadelphia. Some historians think Hamilton did this on purpose, that he wanted to provoke a reaction so he could justify sending in the military. Others say it was just terrible timing and miscommunication. Either way, Lennox needed someone to guide him around the area since he wasn't local, so he asked John Neville to help. John Neville was the regional tax inspector. He was also one of the wealthiest men in southwestern Pennsylvania, big landowner, had a nice estate called Bower Hill. During the Revolution, he'd fought alongside these farmers. He was a respected figure. But now, he was the face of the tax, and people hated him for it. On July 15, 1794, Lennox and Neville rode out to the home of William Miller. Miller was a farmer and a distiller, and here's the kicker. He was related to Neville by marriage. When they handed him the writ, Miller was furious. He later said, "I felt my blood boil at seeing General Neville along to pilot the sheriff to my very door." Word spread fast. As Lennox and Neville were leaving, a group of Miller's neighbors showed up, armed with pitchforks and muskets. Some of them had been drinking. Someone yelled something about federal agents dragging people away. Lennox and Neville explained that it wasn't true and rode off. But as they left, someone fired a shot. Nobody was hit, but the fuse was lit. The next morning, July 16th, about 30 to 40 men showed up at Neville's house, Bower Hill. Most of them were from the Mingo Creek militia. They'd been served writs the day before. They thought Marshal Lennox was hiding inside, and they wanted him. They also wanted Neville to resign and hand over his tax records. Neville came to the door. The crowd demanded he surrender. Neville responded by firing a shot through the window. He killed Oliver Miller, Jr., a young farmer who was William Miller's nephew. Gunfire erupted. Neville had help. His slaves were inside, loading weapons and firing from their quarters. After a shootout, the militia retreated. One of their guys was dead, others were wounded. But they weren't done. They went to Couch's fort to get reinforcements. The next day, July 17th, they came back. But this time they brought 500 to 700 men. They were organized, they had drums, they marched like an army. Neville had reinforcements too. 10 U.S. Army soldiers from Fort Pitt had arrived, led by Major Abraham Kirkpatrick, who was Neville's brother-in-law. Before the rebels showed up, Kirkpatrick helped Neville escape. They hid him in a ravine nearby. When the rebels arrived and demanded that Neville surrender, Kirkpatrick said he wasn't there. The rebels didn't believe him. They demanded to search the house for tax records. Kirkpatrick refused. The women and children were allowed to leave. Then the shooting started. The battle lasted about an hour. The rebel commander was James McFarland, a Revolutionary War veteran who'd fought at Yorktown. At some point, there seemed to be a ceasefire. Some say there was a white flag. McFarland stepped into the open, probably thinking they could negotiate. A shot rang out from the house. McFarland fell. He died there in front of his men. The rebels went crazy with rage. They set fire to everything, the barn, the slave quarters, the outbuildings. As the flames got closer to the main house, the soldiers surrendered. The rebels took them prisoner, then burned Bower Hill to the ground. Neville's entire estate was destroyed. McFarland's death changed everything. He was a respected war hero. To the rebels, it felt like murder during a truce. Now, this wasn't just about taxes anymore. It was personal. It was about honor. Some of the more radical leaders started talking about revolution. After Bower Hill burned, the rebellion spread. A lawyer named David Bradford took charge. He was the deputy attorney for Washington County, and he was done playing nice. Bradford did something pretty bold. He ordered the U.S. mail robbed. He wanted to see who was writing letters supporting the government. They found several, and Bradford used those names to identify traitors. He called for a mass gathering. On August 1st, 1794, about 5,000 to 7,000 armed men gathered at Braddock's Field, just outside Pittsburgh. This was huge. This was an army. They marched on Pittsburgh with drums and flags. Some of them were talking about taking over the city, maybe even marching east. Pittsburgh was terrified. People there weren't part of the rebellion. They tried to show the rebels they were sympathetic. When the rebels marched into town, local officials met them, tried to calm things down. There was some looting and some property damage, but the moderates managed to prevent a massacre. Still, the message was clear. This was no longer just angry farmers refusing to pay taxes. This was an organized, armed resistance to the federal government. Back in Philadelphia, President Washington was getting reports of all this, and he was in a tough spot. On one hand, he understood that people had legitimate grievances. He'd even been skeptical of the whiskey tax when Hamilton first proposed it. He traveled through Virginia and Pennsylvania in 1791 to ask people what they thought. Local officials told him it was fine, but those were Eastern officials, not Western farmers. On the other hand, he was the president of a brand new country. The Constitution was only a few years old. If the federal government passed a law and people could just ignore it or violently resist it, what did that say about the government's authority? What did that say about the Constitution? Washington met with his cabinet on August 2, 1794. The debate was intense. Hamilton wanted immediate military action. He thought any sign of weakness would encourage more rebellions. Thomas Jefferson and others worried about using military force against American citizens. Washington tried one more time for a peaceful solution. On August 7, he issued a proclamation calling the violence an act of treason and ordering the rebels to disperse by September 1. He also sent 3 commissioners to negotiate: Pennsylvania's Attorney General William Bradford, State Supreme Court Justice Jasper Yates, and Senator James Ross. But at the same time, he got legal authorization to call up the militia. Supreme Court Justice James Wilson certified that local authorities couldn't handle the situation. Under the Militia Act of 1792, that meant the president could federalize state militias. Washington called for troops from Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey, and Virginia. The response was massive. Almost 13,000 men assembled. That was bigger than any single army Washington had commanded during the entire Revolutionary War. Meanwhile, the commissioners went west to negotiate. They met with a 15-member committee representing the rebels. This committee included some moderates like Albert Gallatin and Hugh Henry Brackenridge, but also radicals like David Bradford. The government's terms were simple: denounce the violence, submit to federal law, and there would be amnesty for most people. The rebel committee barely agreed. It was a close vote. Then they held a referendum among the broader population to see if people would accept these terms. The vote happened on September 11th. It passed, but it wasn't overwhelming. A lot of people still opposed compliance. The commissioners reported back to Washington on September 24th. The civil authority must be aided by a military force to secure a due execution of the laws. That was it. Washington ordered the troops to march. On September 30th, 1794, George Washington mounted his horse and rode out to lead the army. He was 62 years old, and he became the first and still the only sitting American president to personally lead troops into battle. Well, sort of. He made part of the journey on horseback for the symbolism, but most of the trip he was in a carriage. Still, the message was clear. The president himself was coming. The army was split into 2 wings. They staged at Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and Cumberland, Maryland. Washington traveled with them as far as Bedford, Pennsylvania. He reviewed the troops, attended church services, and held meetings with officers. Everywhere he went, people lined the streets. Some were enthusiastic, others were scared. Once Washington was confident the rebellion would collapse without a major battle, he left to return to Philadelphia. He had presidential duties to attend to. He left General Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee in command, a Revolutionary War hero and the governor of Virginia, and Hamilton stayed with the troops too, as a civilian advisor. The army continued west, slowly, carefully, showing overwhelming force. And you know what happened? By the time they reached western Pennsylvania in late October, the rebels had vanished. No army was waiting for them, no battle lines, just regular farmers going about their business. Most of the rebel leaders had fled. David Bradford escaped to Spanish territory, what is now Louisiana. Others hid or blended back into their communities. The people who had been so fired up at Braddock's Field just 2 months earlier went home. The army did round up about 150 people. They arrested them, interrogated them, and looked for evidence. Hamilton was particularly aggressive about this, trying to find proof of conspiracy and treason. A lot of people were released pretty quickly because there was not enough evidence. Eventually, only about 20 were charged with serious crimes. Two men, John Mitchell and Philip Weigel, were actually convicted of treason, the first treason convictions in United States history, but Washington later pardoned both of them. He described Mitchell as a simpleton and Weigel as insane. Basically, he did not think they were the real ringleaders and did not want to make martyrs out of them. By the end of 1794, federal troops were occupying western Pennsylvania. They stayed through the winter, and the Whiskey Rebellion was over. No major battles, no bloodshed once the army arrived. It just fizzled out. So was the Whiskey Rebellion a success? Depends on who you ask. For Washington and Hamilton, absolutely. They proved the federal government could enforce its laws. They showed that armed resistance would not be tolerated. They sent a message to anyone else thinking about rebelling. The Constitution means something, and we will defend it. Foreign governments were watching too. Britain, France, and Spain all wondered if this new American experiment would fall apart. Would the states turn on each other? Would regional differences tear the country apart? Washington's response showed that the United States had staying power. But here is the thing. Even though the rebellion was suppressed, the tax remained almost impossible to collect. Western farmers still refused to pay it. Tax collectors still could not do their jobs without fear. In Kentucky, for example, not a single person was successfully prosecuted for tax evasion. The resistance continued, just without the violence. The rebellion also changed politics. It helped solidify the divide between Federalists and Republicans, who later became Democrats. The Federalists, Hamilton's people, believed in a strong central government, supported the tax, and thought the military response was necessary. The Republicans, Jefferson's people, thought the tax was unfair, the military response was excessive, and the whole thing proved Hamilton had too much power. This became a major issue in the 1800 presidential election. John Adams, a Federalist, was running for re-election. Thomas Jefferson was the Republican challenger. Jefferson and his party made the whiskey tax a rallying cry. They argued it represented government overreach and elite control. Jefferson won, and one of the first things he did as president was appoint Albert Gallatin as Secretary of the Treasury. Gallatin, remember him? The moderate from the rebellion who had been on that 15-member committee. Hamilton had actually tried to have him arrested for treason, but they could not prove anything. When Gallatin took over the Treasury, Jefferson asked him to review all of Hamilton's financial systems, basically hoping to find evidence of corruption or mismanagement. But Gallatin came back and said, "I have found the most perfect system ever formed. Any change that should be made in it would injure it." Hamilton made no blunders, committed no frauds. He did nothing wrong. Jefferson was apparently disappointed by that, but Gallatin still recommended one change: repeal the internal taxes, including the whiskey tax. And in 1802, Congress did exactly that. The tax was gone. The thing that started the whole rebellion had been repealed. From that point until the War of 1812, the federal government relied entirely on tariffs, taxes on imported goods for revenue. So in a way, the rebels won. It took 8 years, but the tax they hated was eliminated. The Whiskey Rebellion was more than just a fight over taxes. It was about identity, about who Americans were and what America meant. For the Western farmers, America was supposed to be different from Britain. It was supposed to respect ordinary people, give them a voice, not in favor of wealthy elites in distant cities. When they saw the whiskey tax, designed by a government in Philadelphia, benefiting Eastern merchants and crushing small Western farmers, it felt like betrayal, like the revolution hadn't really changed anything. For Washington and Hamilton, America needed to prove it could govern itself. Democracy was an experiment. Nobody knew if it would work. If laws could be ignored whenever people disagreed with them, the whole system would collapse into anarchy. They needed to show that elections and representatives and the rule of law actually meant something. Both sides had a point, honestly. The rebellion raised questions that America is still wrestling with today. What do you do when the law feels unjust? When do protests cross the line into rebellion? How much force should the government use to enforce its laws? When is resistance justified? The founders didn't all agree on the answers. Jefferson thought the rebellion was mostly justified and the military response was overkill. He later said that an insurrection was announced and proclaimed and armed against but could never be found, basically arguing it was overblown. Hamilton thought the opposite. He believed showing strength was essential. The government had to respond overwhelmingly to any threat to its authority. The government ought to inspire respect with a display of strength, he wrote. Washington tried to walk a middle line. He genuinely regretted having to send troops against American citizens, but he felt he had no choice. And afterwards, when it was over, he pardoned most of the prisoners. He didn't want revenge, he just wanted compliance. The Whiskey Rebellion also exposed the regional tensions that would keep growing. East versus West, urban versus rural, industrial economy versus agricultural economy. Different ways of life with different needs, all trying to exist under one government. These tensions didn't go away after 1794. They kept building. Western expansion made them worse. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the size of the country, bringing in more frontier territories with their own interests. The slavery question divided North and South. Eventually, these regional differences would explode into the Civil War. But in 1794, the country held together, barely. Washington made the hard choice to lead troops against his own people. The rebels ultimately chose to back down rather than fight, because both sides were more committed to the idea of America than to winning their particular argument.